Discovering Implicit Bias, Jedi Training presented by the Mid-Hudson Library System. These self-paced trainings are meant to help library staff members discover more about justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, not only in the workplace, but the world at large. The questions asked throughout these trainings are meant for private reflection. Let us watch the following video from Jubilee Media, where people ask themselves, how can I be anti-racist?
How do you think actively you can dismantle anti-black attitude first in your personal circle?
Can you repeat the question one more time?
I think.
I don't know. Gosh, sorry.
I remember, I feel bad calling my family out. We were at the DMV once and my mom made a comment about, well, you're in America, you should speak English, because someone was speaking to their family member in, I think, a Middle Eastern language, and I corrected her. I was like, America doesn't have a national language. We're a nation of immigrants.
Within the Hispanic community, a common comment that's brought up is that they don't want their daughters and sons to marry or date Black people. A lot of the times there's a sense of humor behind that it's just a joke or it's harmless and it's not serious. But to me, even if it is a joke, it's not a joke that's funny.
Out of my entire family, I'm actually the only one who is in support of the Black Lives Matter movement. And it is very difficult to talk to my family. One thing that I want to do is to get together and perhaps have a movie night and suggest, for example, 13th, that does explore the concept of systemic racism.
Let the people know around you the current effects of colonization and the attitude that we've all gotten kind of from being taught through an entire lens of white supremacy. Everybody thinks of it as kind of a past thing.
I remember the first slur when I was 4 or 5. These guys were like, your skin looks like poop, you smell like shit, we don't want to play with you, you're the color of shit. So it was kind of okay, I knew from very young that I was going to encounter, these attitudes. I think there is internalized racism because racism is systematic. We get indoctrinated with it. So I see a lot of colorism, lighter, brighter, better. So the closer you are to whiteness, whether it's hair, whether it's the way you speak, or I see some of that.
Black people who are around people that seek to practice anti-Blackness. Be you unapologetically. The more you practice that, the more you put yourself out there without any qualms or asking questions, the more it forces those people to see you and to see themselves as a result.
In Hispanic culture, we refer to some African Americans as negritos, and that's a very derogatory just verbiage that is common where we're from in our village, where I came from and immigrated from. Being in this country as an immigrant and now luckily being able to be a DACA recipient and a dreamer, the conversation I talk to my parents about is, you had to have a conversation with me about police because what that means for me being deported possibly one day. But African-American kids have to have this conversation about their skin color, which they had no decision of.
Listen to Black people when we talk about anything that makes us uncomfortable. If someone in your inner circle is saying the N-word and thinking you're overreacting or thinking we're overreacting for being offended by it, don't let it slide just because that person is your friend.
My high school was predominantly white people, and white people saying the N-word was very common, and no teacher or adult really questioned it.
When addressing someone who is racist is to address them as hard as it is with a little bit more compassion and kindness. I think when you address someone boldly and attack them, then they're just on defense mode and not willing to listen, kind of approaching it on more of a level of love helps people to be a little bit more open-minded.
Oh, that's hard too. Man.
If you have to explain that what you're saying isn't a race joke, maybe you shouldn't be saying it.
Do you have an example of when it happened?
Yeah, so actually, it was towards someone, a person of color, and they mentioned that they had to be in the back of the restaurant because of their color. And I did mention it to a manager, actually, about how I did feel uncomfortable about certain things being said. And it actually kind of felt like it was being brushed off, and it actually led me to leave the company.
Being paid less than their white counterparts. I know it's the rule that they tell you in the workplace is not to discuss wages. I think if people can push for a more transparent conversations to have in the workplace, that's a good way to be an ally and make sure everyone is being treated and compensated fairly.
So I think there's a lot of training as far as sexual harassment goes and orderly misconduct within the workforce, but I don't think there's a lot of training videos that touch base on racism.
So they had a full day worth of training, and in this training, someone opened up in that conversation, and she was saying how she's a white woman who has a son who's a white male, a teenager, and she has recently been so fearful of how he's interpreting everything in the way that he might be exposed to a group of people who have a mindset that, you know, Black lives don't matter. It got her so emotional that she was in tears because she was asking for help. How do I educate my son to make sure he understands this? And just by having that conversation, you know, it opened up a lot of doors.
I am in the holistic field, so I teach yoga, meditation, breath work. And in this field, you see a lot of advertisement. You see a lot of the teachers who are prominent with large followings, they're white. I feel that if we're going to share culture, that there should be an amplification of Black voices just because they've been actively suppressed.
It's seen as unprofessional to have braids or to have twists, and those are protective styles of Black women and men.
Black women are 3 to 4 times more likely than white women to die in childbirth, and that's because there's these stereotypes that Black women are strong and aggressive compared to white women being fragile and feminine, and so it really has an impact on how Black people express their pains and how it's received by healthcare professionals.
It is important to listen, and you want to listen with the intent to understand. A lot of times people listen with the intent to reply to everything, and we just want to be understood.
We have to put defenses down and stop assuming that racism is a problem for other people, but you yourself could never be racist. I think that's the most harmful idea to have.
An easy thing that every individual can do is to vote. You know, on your local level, your local government, for the presidential election.
I seek to make people that feel anti-Blackness, that are struck by the sight of it or the existence of it, I seek to make those people uncomfortable, because that uncomfortability ultimately leads to them asking the important questions.
There was a certain point that I was not sexually attracted to like Black folks, like Black men. And I think it's because of the implicit bias that I had growing up. I try to recognize within myself in certain situations, and I try to fight against it.
If you want to see, is police brutality a problem, you can just look it up. It's right there.
America, oftentimes the real color that they see is green, and if we can research where we put our money and see what they're doing with it, who are they donating it to, are they using your money to oppress Black people, then you need to take your dollars and put it into companies that are more progressive.
I'm sorry, I thought I had so many good things to say. Use whatever privilege you can to amplify Black voices.
They say I talk like, oh, you're the whitest Black girl I've ever met. And I hate it. I've always hated it. But in the moment, I'm like, ah, but it's not okay.
Being brave, that sounds probably silly, but I think it can be really, really hard to have conversations like this, and just taking the first step of like opening it up, even when it's really uncomfortable.
Anti-racism is not a one-day thing. It is something that will take the rest of our lives. Even after all of the media has gone down, even after all of the protesters have gone away, even when there's no one no longer saying it, we still have to live it. We have to live it every day. Don't just say Black Lives Matter. Live Black Lives Matter.
Let's learn more about implicit bias. Watch the following TED Talk with Deshaw Hockett, the founder and executive director of Safe Places for the Advancement of Community and Equity, Spaces, a Washington, D.C.-based leadership development and community building organization dedicated to bridging the gap between what people imagine and what they achieve.
I want to make an argument to you. I want to make a case to you. And the argument that I want to make is that the way that we currently think about, talk about, and act on issues of racial bias and other lines of difference in this country is woefully inadequate and it's incomplete. The way we think about, talk about, and act on issues of racial bias and other lines of difference in this country is woefully inadequate and it's incomplete. And in making this case, I want to build on the very robust and compelling evidence that has been coming out of the science community for the past 10 plus years that suggests that if we want to move to a radically different place, a radically better place on issues of race and difference in this country, we have to pay attention to something called implicit bias. So what is implicit bias? Oprah Winfrey has talked about it. Malcolm Gladwell has written about it. Normally we say when Oprah is talking about it and Malcolm is writing about it, everybody knows about it, which isn't always the case. So a bias is a preference for or a prejudice against a person or a group of people. There are three characteristics that make a bias implicit. Characteristic number one, implicit biases operate at the subconscious level, outside of conscious awareness. We don't know that we have them, and they can't be accessed through introspection. In other words, the science of implicit bias says that none of us can sit here in this room right now, scratch our heads, and wonder out loud, do I have a bias against men, against women, against black people, against white people, against immigrants, and expect to accurately answer that question, because the nature of an implicit bias is such that we don't know that we have them. Characteristic number two, implicit biases oftentimes run contrary to our conscious stated beliefs about who we are as human beings and what our values are. In other words, the science of implicit bias says that you can be a school administrator and say that you are deeply committed to nurturing and building up young people, and yet be the same school administrator who leads your school in high rates of suspensions and expulsions of young people. And both of those things would be true. Consciously, you're deeply committed to building young people up. Unconsciously, you're doing harm in the process. The science of implicit bias says that you can be a law enforcement officer deeply committed to the mantra that appears on the side of police vehicles that says what? Protect and serve. And yet be the same law enforcement officer who leads your precinct or your district in high rates of stops and frisks of young men of color. And both of those things would be true. Consciously, you're deeply committed to the principles of protecting and serving. unconsciously, your behavior is inconsistent with that. The third characteristic that makes a bias implicit is that implicit biases are triggered through rapid and automatic mental associations that we make between people, ideas, and objects, and the attitudes and stereotypes that we hold about those people, ideas, and objects. And so, case in point, I want to do a quick exercise around the power of mental association. So in a minute, I'm going to flash a few words on the screen, and what I want to ask you to do is I want you to quickly reflect on and or call out the associations that you make with those words or that you believe the broader society makes with those words. And so this requires a little bit of call and response. So, government. Corporate. Suburbs. Subsidized housing. So the science of implicit bias would say that those associations that you just made, those aren't mere verbal associations. Those aren't mere mental associations. The science says that there are attitudes and behaviors that we attach to those associations. So imagine if, as part of my introduction, I came out here and I said, my name is Deshaw. I want to talk with you about something innovative. And I'm here representing local government. I used to work in corporate America. I was born and raised in subsidized housing, but I now live in the suburbs of Alexandria, Virginia. The science would suggest that for many of you, for those who said that your automatic mental association with government is corrupt, or your automatic mental association with corporate is greed, you would receive me through that filter, oftentimes at the unconscious level. And it would color for you every single word that comes out of my mouth. So that's how implicit bias works. These rapid and automatic mental associations that shape and mold behavior every single day, oftentimes in ways that we're not even aware of, oftentimes in ways that do harm to others. So there are three reasons why focusing on implicit bias at this particular moment in time is important, and why I believe that a focus on implicit bias can help move this country forward. So, number one, an implicit bias focus gives us a much more expansive diagnosis of the challenges that we face in this country with respect to difference. What do I mean? We know from the work of esteemed scholars Mazarine Banaji and Anthony Greenwald that a significant amount of the harm being experienced and transmitted in this country with respect to racial bias and other lines of difference, we know that a significant amount of that harm stems from implicit forms of bias in addition to explicit forms of bias. Yet the majority of the tools that we use to address bias are designed to address explicit forms, not the implicit. So in essence, what we have in this country is a mismatch, a disconnect between how we diagnose challenges around difference and how we treat them. An implicit bias approach gives us a much more expansive diagnosis and a much more expansive toolbox. And my belief is that if we get the diagnosis right, we will get the treatment right. If we continue to get the diagnosis wrong, we will get the treatment. Number two, implicit bias is both predictive and it's preventive. Predictive in the sense that a person can go to the website for Project Implicit, take any one of the online implicit association tests, and receive a test result that can serve as a predictor of discriminatory behavior. It's preventive in the sense that there are emerging and promising strategies coming out of the science community that suggests with internal motivation and habitual practice, we can do things to reduce our vulnerability to act on our biases. And I believe that that is what the country needs right now. We need a prevention approach around issues of bias and difference versus an emergency room response. Right now, we have an emergency room response. We wait for stuff to happen, then we rush to the emergency room. We need a prevention approach, and implicit bias gives us that. Lastly, and number 3, implicit bias, or an implicit bias approach, helps to reduce the shame and the shaming that's associated with talking about and addressing issues of bias. Author and researcher Brené Brown draws an interesting distinction between guilt and shame. She says, guilt says, I made a mistake and I can do something about it. Shame says, I am a mistake. This is who I am. I'm a horrible human being. There's nothing I can do about it. I'm going to always be this way. And what I want to submit to you is that my belief is that one of the biggest challenges that we have in this country and how we address issues of bias is that we engage in self-shaming, and if we're honest, sometimes we intentionally and unintentionally shame others. And my belief is that as long as we continue to do that, human beings would never feel the motivation that they need to do the self-change work or the broader societal change work that we need to do. An implicit bias approach addresses this because it makes the central question not are you racist or not racist, are you sexist or not sexist. An implicit bias approach makes the central question, how do we get our actions and behaviors, how do we align our actions and behaviors with our consciously held egalitarian beliefs? Or at least for those people who do hold egalitarian beliefs. And my belief is that many people do. So that's why this work is important at this particular moment in time. And in closing, I want to leave you with a quick idea. The late child psychologist Yuri Bronfenbrenner once said that every child needs at least one adult in his or her life who is irrationally crazy about him or her. Raise your hand if you've had that at any point in your life. And so you know what it feels like. My belief is that not only does every child need that, but every human being needs at least one other human being in their life who is irrationally crazy about him or her. And the only way that we're going to have that is if we do the internal change work that we need to do to make the external change work possible. Thank you very much.
Want to discover how you can make a difference? Start by learning about yourself. Project Implicit is a nonprofit collaboration between researchers who are interested in implicit social cognition, thoughts and feelings outside of conscious awareness and control. The goal of the organization is to educate the public about hidden biases and to provide a virtual laboratory for collecting data on the internet. You can easily visit implicit.harvard.edu/implicit/takeatest.html to learn about their data privacy and to take a test. Thank you. Further readings: Blink by Malcolm Gladwell. Whistling Vivaldi: How Stereotypes Affect Us and What We Can Do by Claude M. Steele.